Foothills Farm is in the Cascade Mountain foothills of northwest Washington. The farm grows produce on 5 acres in rotation with a flock of about 1,000 pastured hens. Matt Steinman, the owner and manager, is passionate about regenerative agriculture and uses no imported fertilizer or pesticides.
Hi, I'm Matt Steinman from Foothills Farms. We are a multi-generational family farm. My grandparents acquired the land back in the 40s. It had gone to receivership out of a logging company. So basically, it went from being logged to going right into our family. There weren't pesticides, it wasn't sprayed, it's been all natural the way Nana and Papa want it to be.
My name is Louisa Brower. I got my PhD in crop science from Washington State University, and now I work independently as technical advisor to the Foothills Farm Fermented Feed Study. In this study, we are trying to compare the effect of fermenting the poultry feed with the effect of hydrating it. And we're comparing both of those feed preparation methods with feeding the birds dry feed. And we are interested in whether we can detect any outcomes of different feed preparation methods on the health of the birds and on their egg production, with ultimately the goal of seeing whether feed fermentation could have an economic benefit for farmers.
So we started fermenting our flock here at Foothills 6 years ago. Somebody threw it across my bow, hey, you should try this. It might be healthier for your flock, which was the first key that I really appreciated, and then also that you might get better lay from your flock. And pretty quickly I saw that they started laying more eggs almost immediately. It was not middle of summer, but early summer, and so it was already starting to get hot, and so we were starting to see the effects of dehydration in birds and just hot weather, where you have to continuously re-up the water, change the water and whatnot, and so, but with fermented food, the water is already included.
So fermentation describes the action of bacteria and yeast on a foodstuff. The bacteria and yeast, they basically start to digest molecules in the substrate, the food that you're fermenting, and they break down some of those larger molecules. They might release some micronutrients like minerals, and it's thought to make those components more available to whoever is consuming the food, so whether that's a person or a chicken.
I got really interested in the background of fermentation and the processes and the reasoning for doing that as I started to see our flock become, we started to lay more eggs. Going to a farmer's market, so we had a higher egg production in the middle of summer, which is where ladies start to plateau and fall off in their production, and we continued to stay high, which helped us gain more customer base.
Together with Louisa, Matt applied for grant funding from the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program to learn more about how feed fermentation was affecting the pastured laying hens at Foothills Farm. Matt and Louisa put together a trial that started in 2018 and which they hope will show whether feed fermentation influences the profitability of Matt's laying flock or the health of the birds.
I tried to design a study that would tell us whether fermenting the feed had any advantage over just feeding it dry. And then a really key component of that was, are we just seeing the effect of water in the feed? Is it the actual fermentation? So that's why we added in the hydrated feed treatment.
The base feed Matt is using is a complete mash that has not been subjected to any heat treatment. The fermented feed is simply made by mixing 1 part feed by weight in 2 parts water and soaking for 2 days. The hydrated feed is made by mixing the same quantities of feed and water, but just before feeding.
So the way we set up the study, we bought 90 birds, 90 chicks, and we raised them all together on a dry food, and then at 10 weeks old, we separated them into 30 birds, 30 ladies that were on fermented, 30 ladies on dry, and 30 ladies on the hydrated food. A few weeks later after that, we separated them into 9 separate coops with 10 birds each. And those 9, and it's the same thing, it's 3 replications of the 3 groups. So we have now 3 coops of fermented feed, 3 coops of dry feed, and 3 groups of hydrated feed. And so these girls they were all born on the same day. And they came together in the same grouping, and then they all were raised in the same brooder on the same dry food until 10 weeks. So everything has been as similar as possible. And then they were separated into their 3 different categories of food types with 3 replications of those categories.
So there have been a large number of lab studies where they could show a nutritional advantage of fermented feed. We wanted to know whether that difference was enough to make an economic impact at the farm level.
I'll be really excited at the end of the study to see the data, because as we're coming into the midsummer right now, we are starting to see, I feel personally that I'm starting to see a difference in all 3 coops and how they're laying eggs.
This study is unique because there's very little on-farm research comparing fermented feed with dry feed or hydrated feed. And this was an opportunity to actually do that systematically. And we think that the results that we'll be able to get from this study will be super useful to other farmers who might be considering fermentation. You know, it takes work to set up the infrastructure to provide fermented feed for a large flock of birds. We want to be able to tell them whether that will be worth their while.
The Foothills Farm study wrapped in the fall of 2019, and the results were striking.
It was really exciting, I gotta say. Going through this whole thing, even starting it, I felt really comfortable that we were gonna see an increased production numbers from them, you know, and how that came about, that was, for me, going to be one of the more interesting parts.
We found that hens on the fermented feed laid about 9% more eggs over the course of the year than hens on the dry feed, and that result was statistically significant, meaning we think that other farms would see a similar result. So we wanted to know if fermented feed hens were eating more in order to produce those extra eggs. But our measurements show they ate about the same amount of feed as the dry feed birds, and that's after the weight of the added water was subtracted. And that means they required less feed to produce each egg, or in other words, the fermented feed was generating more revenue per pound than the dry feed.
This result was in line with previous research showing that fermentation can improve nutrient availability in poultry feed. But the Foothills team was surprised to see such a clear effect in an on-farm context where there's so much variability and it can be so difficult to pick out a clear signal even in a replicated experiment.
We feel we saw very convincing evidence of physiological benefits from feeding the hens fermented feed.
Results were not as positive for the hydrated feed. Hens on the hydrated feed laid 11% fewer eggs than birds on the dry feed.
What seems to have happened in the hydrated diet is that the feed particles swelled up after water was added, but didn't have time to break down at all. So the birds filled up their crops before they could eat enough to really satisfy their nutritional needs. We were using a whole grain feed, so there were wheat berries and other particles that could get quite big. In the fermented feed, they broke down into a sort of paste, which allowed the birds to eat as much as they needed.
While fermented feed generated more eggs than dry feed, and therefore more revenue, it did take more work.
We analysed the farm's labour records and calculated that at Foothills it takes one person about 50 minutes a day to prepare and distribute dry feed to a flock of 100 birds, whereas it takes more like 80 minutes for fermented feed, which involves adding water and stirring a few times. And of course the wet feed is more difficult to transport. However, you don't need to refill watering stations in the field as frequently for birds on a wet fermented diet because their diet contains water and so they don't need to drink as much. Birds on dry feed require water refills up to 4 times a day in hot weather.
Overall, labor costs of fermented feed at Foothills were higher than that of dry feed, but the increased egg production made up for it economically.
We found that once all the labour costs and feed costs were subtracted from egg sales, net revenue was highest for the birds on the fermented feed compared to dry or hydrated feed. So that's an interesting result for other farmers, especially if, like Matt, they have a direct connection to their consumers who will appreciate the extra effort of using fermented feed because of its physiological benefits for the hens, and who may even be willing to pay more for the meat or eggs.
It just really empowers me to go forward with fermented feed because our egg quality is just so much higher. We always go to market and we're one of the very best eggs.
Matt plans on continuing to use fermented feed in the future and working on ways to improve the efficiency of the feed preparation and transport. You can read the full report of the Foothills Farm study on the website of Western SARE, Sustainable Agriculture, Research and Education.